Thank you. So welcome to BC Academic Libraries Winter Event 2021 on implementing decolonial practices amongst academic library services and workers. My name is David Gill, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I identify as a settler of South Asian descent. I am the MC, and my fellow BCALS continuing education coordinators, Alexander Krukowski and Susie Wilson, will be moderating the chat. If you have any technical issues, please direct them to Alex. On the chat, if you're interested in asking questions to the speakers, please direct them to Susie. If you would like to live tweet the event, please use hashtag BCALS 2021 and follow our Twitter page here at BC_ALS. So this is day 2 of BCALS and Keeping It Real events on building capacity. BCALS would like to thank Keeping It Real sponsors, UBC Library, UVic Libraries, SFU Library, and the UBC iSchool for allowing us to make this event free by providing funds for an honorarium to the panelists. So this is our schedule for today. So I would like to let you know that due to unforeseen circumstances, the format of our panel has changed. Karleen has graciously agreed to continue, and we will be refocusing this session in an in-depth conversation with her on the topics proposed for the panel. We want to acknowledge the work our other panelists has put into the session, and even though she could not join us today. So we expect the panel discussion will be a lot shorter, so more time for lunch. I personally look forward to lunch every day. So Sashi Lacey, the BCALS chair, will lead the land acknowledgement.
Great, thank you, David. And I might just ask one of my colleagues just to spotlight me for just the duration of the land acknowledgement, just so folks can see me. Great, thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to see so many of you here. And like David said, my name is Sajni Lacey, and I'm currently the chair of the British Columbia Academic Library section. And again, I'd just like to welcome you here this morning and thank you for attending. And just to give a brief description of myself, I present as a white woman with dark brown hair and bangs. I wear glasses, wearing a light blue long sleeve shirt today with my orange shirt day pin today. So I'd like to begin our time together this morning by taking a moment to acknowledge and give thanks to the Syilx Okanagan Nation, whose traditional, unceded, ancestral, and ongoing land UBC Okanagan occupies, and that's whose lands I currently live and work on as an uninvited but very grateful guest. The work of this event and the major focus of the BCALS executive this year has been on how library workers and academic libraries can engage, develop, and take action towards decolonizing anti-racist and anti-oppressive work. For those of us who work in academic libraries, and especially those of us who are settlers on these lands, we need to continue to acknowledge and address the ongoing impact that settler colonial violence and oppression has and is having on the students, faculty, staff at our institutions and in the wider community. The long and ongoing history, learning, and knowledge that is passed from generation to generation of Indigenous peoples on these lands since time immemorial should take precedence as we continue to work towards reconciliation and celebration of the Indigenous peoples whose lands all of our institutions occupy. I'm doing this acknowledgement in part to affirm the personal and professional commitments BCALS has and the continued responsibility we as settlers have to improving our understanding and recognition of the land that we are on, as well as the peoples, cultures, and languages that encompass this relationship. I invite you to reflect on your own position and relationships, as well as acknowledging the self-care and space you may need in this time. Please feel free to leave your cameras off, as has been stated. Take space where you need, take time where you need, and we're going to now move forward with welcoming our fantastic guest.
Thank you, Sajni. So as I mentioned, Rachel Chong the Indigenous Engagement and Subject Liaison Librarian at Kwantlen Polytechnic University Library, is unable to make it today, but Karleen Delaurier-Lyle, who uses she, hers pronouns, is one of our panelists. She is the Information Services Librarian at ReAL Library. She is Anishinaabe and Cree mixed settler ancestry and is a member of Burns River First Nations. She is born and raised on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Silk Okanagan people. She received her BA from the University of British Columbia, UBC Okanagan, in Indigenous Studies and Gender and Women's Studies. So now we're going to start on the questions. So first question is, can you tell us more about your work on decolonization and indigenization at your institution?
Okay, can you hear me okay, David? Excellent. Okay, so at the University of British Columbia in 2020, they recently launched the Indigenous Strategic Plan, which outlines 8 goals and 43 specific actions. So I'm going to add this into the chat so that people can take a look and open this up. Myself, Kayla Larson, Sarah DuPont, Tamis Cochran, and other academic university librarians together created the ISP implementation steering team. So our goal is to essentially take a look at what's been outlined on the site that I've added in here, and see how we can implement this across UBC Library as a whole at the Vancouver campus. So I just wanted to acknowledge Tamis Cochran, who went through the self-assessment. Within the ISP, you can find a self-assessment that anyone is welcome to use. And the first thing that we started with was to translate. Tamis had translated all of the questions that you can find starting on page 9 into a Qualtrics survey. And then we went with our team, the steering committee, to just answer the questions for our respective branches and units, and then assess ourselves. And the next steps are to take a look at the answers from the survey and see how well we're doing, or maybe some gaps and some areas to work on, and then revisit this. And the staff at ReAL Library, excluding Eleanor Wellwood, will be going through a series of workshops with UBC Library as part of the steering committee. And that's for UBC Library as a whole. But I wanted to make sure that I talked about how ReAL Library picks up this work individually. And I think one of the major resources that we worked really hard on creating, and I wanted to acknowledge our student librarian, Kayla Morwood, who helped me to create this as well, is our decolonization and anti-racism guide. And essentially what we had in mind for this resource was acknowledging that the ISP was going to be coming out soon, and that many of our patrons at UBC, faculty, staff across the board, and students as well, would be looking at how they're going to be able to bring this into either their coursework or their projects and their research. So we created this research guide to facilitate that process from a research standpoint, because that's our job as one of the libraries at UBC.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question then. Can you speak about how you go about delivering reference and customer service, instruction, etc., using decolonization and indigenization principles?
Yeah, I'll start with reference. Typically at the reference desk, broadly speaking, as the reference librarian, our job is to connect a patron with the resource that they're looking for. Just kind of broadly speaking, overview of that process. But what I'm finding is that there's more complicated ways that we will discover resources or connect resources to people depending on identity or the nature of the resource. So what people intend on doing with the information that they find is really important. But there's also pieces of critical thinking around who created the resource, what was their perspective, what was the context for how the information was created at the time. We run into tricky situations where just because something is publicly made available, people's intent with it could be harmful. So an example of this was on the coast there, on the coast of Vancouver area, there's obviously quite a bit of carvers. And with that, there's so much knowledge that people have around that process and who that knowledge is passed on to, and that usually will live within a community member or a community as a whole. And so if someone has made this publicly available, or if we have somehow received a resource within the collection that can teach people how to do this, that doesn't necessarily mean that we just, willy-nilly kind of pass this along, because we know that it's part of our responsibility as information professionals to make sure that there's safety protocols within this. So in regards to reference, I think that it's taken into consideration who the patron is, but also, again, what their intent is. The other piece with reference is there are things that exist outside of our collection that we might be able to find, whether that's in an archive or if somebody within an archive, an archivist has gone ahead and digitized something. But looking at who did they check with in order to make sure that this information was available? Did they check with the people that own this knowledge? Was there anybody that was consulted from that community or nation to advocate for how accurate that is, or if the people telling those stories should be sharing that information? Those are different ways of, I think, safeguarding, or at least having some safety protocols around it. And even again, within the collection, we sometimes will surface information that a while ago may have been okay to share, or it was people had gone through a research process to say, okay, yes, you've gone through all of the checkpoints and you can write a thesis on this, but by today's standard, when we sit with this resource, we're thinking, this needs to, again, we need to maybe do some more safety. So there's measures around access points in that aspect. For customer service, I think this year, because our branch is physically closed due to construction, one of the beautiful things that's come out of this, one of the great outcomes, is that we've had more opportunities to have embedded librarianship within the First Nations House of Learning Longhouse. And we're reminded of these really organic relationship building around getting to know our patrons in a very organic way, where instead of folks rushing to us as soon as they're getting to their deadline, we've already built enough of a repertoire with them that we start to get a sense of what are they studying, what are they interested in, and also who they are. And so by the point that they start looking for resources and needing them, it's not as stressful, or it doesn't have as many of those rushed, oh my gosh, this is going to be due at midnight. And there's a story that I remember from Tamis Cochran, again, a nod to my colleague here, is that she'd built this really great relationship with a student, one of the Longhouse students. And while she was sitting there, she was able to see a patron, a student that needed some support. And the conversation ended up leading to them to taking away that stress, taking away that anxiety, and also the intimidation factor that I think academic libraries can have, and putting a face to a subject librarian that was able to make sure that she was getting the resources that she needed. So I think when it comes to indigenizing customer service or reference services as a whole, it's really just about, I think, how we naturally and intuitively build trust and relationships with people. With instruction, I think I'll just speak personally to this is, yes, I've got my lesson plans and all of that, but even just teachings that I received from my grandmother about the medicine wheel and the various needs that students will come to us with. It's not always just about the resources that they're going to need, their mental side of the medicine wheel. What are they going to be needing for their research projects? It's also, again, how do we emotionally support them in instruction or even in customer service? It's how do we carry that space in order to put people at ease? Or before COVID, we would make sure that there was some sort of food, looking after people's physical, all those aspects that we don't always necessarily think of in a traditional instruction that we would learn in school. And I think, again, all of this is just wrapped up in, all of those aspects is also kind of wrapped up in or grounded in understanding who we are and where we are. So for me, when I'm back at ReAL and I'm walking around what is now UBC, it's also, this daily reminder that I'm on Musqueam territory, and that's something that, this is why our territorial acknowledgements are so important, is that daily reminder and that daily revisiting of, okay, what is it that I'm tasked with today? And how do I pick up and act accordingly in a respectful way, in a respectful manner to my host nation? And that can look different on every day. And I think, or every day, and I think that it's supposed to.
Okay, great. Move on to the next question then. Okay, so question 3, as library workers, we sometimes hear that our colleagues are only interested in practical knowledge for professional development, and they may not see the topic of decolonization and indigenization of academic libraries as practical for their work in reference or teaching or any other library worker activity. What would be your response to this scenario?
This was the toughest question, David. I really think that this in and of itself could be like a day, at least a day's, maybe a week's worth of a workshop and conversations around a table. And I was really struggling to figure out, how am I going to succinctly answer this question? And the best way that I could come up with is, to me, like when I first read this question, it seemed a bit backwards. Because it felt as if the person in front of me, if they were asking me this question, I'd think to myself, okay, so perhaps you're not seeing the benefit to yourself as an individual. How do I translate decolonial or anti-racist work or indigenizing work? How do I translate that into a way that I can get a raise, or that I can get confirmation, and to me, that just didn't really seem like that's the way that the work is supposed to be. So I think if I was posed with this question, I would flip it backwards. And I think that I would create a dialogue on the ways that we benefit by being privileged enough to work in these institutions, or how have we benefit through colonization, whether that's job stability or, even the stabilization of the institutions that we work at, and thinking about where are the places that our day-to-day lives outside of work, how is it that we've benefited and stabilized ourselves based off of that? And what are the repercussions? What's the other half of that to the territories, to the nations that we occupy? What are the things that have been taken away? Maybe unpacking kind of like a historical benefiting through intergenerational privileging in our families that we may have become more upwardly mobile from, or something. And I think that I would start the conversation that way, by individually asking and posing those questions, to then get to the point of, okay, so now that we've talked about all of that, then how do you feel? And their answer could quite honestly be, well, I'm fine with that. I'm good with all of the benefits that I have from this. In which case really don't know how much more I'd collaborate with this person. But I think that I'm demystified enough to understand that not everybody is going to take up decolonization in a way that makes sense to me. Because for me, I think it's hard work. It's not about what's going to get me a higher paycheck, and it was never supposed to be from its inception.
Thank you. It's something I struggle with in communicating to people, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, very tough. Okay, so the next question, we're flying through them. So are there any recent decolonization and indigenization initiatives that you found engaging, enervating, or exacerbating, and why?
Yeah, I think when I read this one, I had many thoughts all at once, different ways that I could kind of get pulled in, especially because there's the emotional triggers within this question as well. And I wanted to focus more on the work that fills me back up. And I immediately thought of several examples of collaboration. I tend to get really excited when I find other people, other information professionals that are running into the same issue or have the same question that needs to be answered. So the first example was, how do we deal with sensitive resources within the collection? And this was a theme of the month, I think, for us. Because one of my coworkers had pulled up a resource. Well, what are we going to do with this? The person's intent, the permissions, yes, you've got the green light, but do we really? What's our role in this? And internally, it ended up with all of us sitting around our kitchen table or our lunchroom table and trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And it was a lot of talking. It was a lot of processing. And we really took our time with it so we could come up with at least as good of a solution as now, as well as an ask for ourselves of, what are we going to do in the future about this? And then I'd say a couple days after this conversation, I was noted by Ashley Edwards, who's the librarian from the Simon Fraser University, who'd run into the same question, right? What's the language and the wording around this? And our head librarian, Sarah DuPont, was generous enough to share an email or some wording around this is the type of language that we might want to think about. So can we extract pieces around this response and share it with one another? And I know Rachel Chong couldn't be here with us today, but I figured, she must be having the same question. And if she hasn't, she might be. And so I get really excited around work where it feels like people's time and dedication to a problem, it can be used in so many places. And that kind of collaborative work, I think, helps us move our efforts in a way that makes sense for all of our time without exhausting us either, because we all know that as diverse librarians, that's something, again, that we'll run into, is that exhaustion. So why not share and trade information and have a reciprocal relationship with one another? The other one that I thought of was Indigenous citations. First of all, because our student population asks for citations often. For my context at ReAL, we get asked around Indigenous citation styles quite often. And I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged Bronwyn Mackay, who's a student librarian with us who's recently graduated, because this was an area that she was really passionate about. And she had done so much work for us when she was in our branch around decolonizing citations, to the point where she was able to do a workshop that was very well received and generated some really amazing resources. Again, she was then tapped and was working with even Larissa McLeod, and she was communicating with Rachel Chong. And so again, you got to see this collaboration and the sharing and this, it was just, I think we don't typically, at least I don't typically see a lot of competition between us, and there doesn't need to be. Christian Ibister from the UBC Okanagan, from the UBC Okanagan Library. I mean, he just came out with the Indigenous Citations LibGuide. And that's amazing because again, our students ask for this all the time. And now I have this incredible LibGuide that we can share out to people. So those are ones that I think energize me, or that I feel very engaged with. Any sort of collaborative work like that.
Thank you, Karleen. They all really sound really interesting. I plan to take a look at them when I have the chance. Okay, so question 5. How would you encourage folks new to these conversations to start with this work? What resources or practice should they consider as they start building their decolonization toolkit?
I think for anybody that's just starting out with this work, the first place that we should always start is knowing whose territory we're on and ourselves in relation to. I think that should always be the foundational piece, because embedded in this, we're able to then revisit that relationship and ask ourselves again, okay, what's my responsibility for today in this work? And also totally acknowledging that not every single person that's on this call is a guest on the territories. They could totally be from those nations. But for myself, if again, I'm a guest. So knowing about the community, knowing about the nations that I'm on, any sort of treaties and what's that history, would be a place that I would absolutely start with. Some of the resources that people use, and a full disclaimer that they are imperfect, but great places to start, are nativeland.ca or Whose Land. And you can just put in your IP address, or your physical address, or even the city, and start from there. From that point, there's always information professionals all over the place that you can ask if you're struggling to find information on any of this. And then, yeah, I think also just discovery or a relearning or a revisiting of ourselves, so our own personal identities, and thinking about not only our heritage and our background and our own families and how they've come to these places, or if they've always been in these places, but also thinking about points of empathy in regards to our identity. So I've had conversations, especially with library professionals, where I do find that we tend to be quite diverse when it comes to gender and sexual orientations. And those have been really amazing entry points for us to kind of find some sort of common ground, for lack of a better term, or word on this. And my advice for anybody that's just starting out in this work is to just always be comfortable with making mistakes and being corrected. There are many times that I've seen for people who don't know where to start, or even when they do begin this work and they start kind of doing their own research, there's a discomfort and an unsettling, and it's meant to. I think that if we're new to these, that's a good sign that you might be headed in the right direction, because there's a normalcy, things that are normalized in so many social aspects of our day-to-day lives that make us make it easier for us to walk through the world, or really uncomfortable. And sometimes when we're undoing things, or we decolonizing things, or our research process or our work process, it makes sense that that newness is going to make us uncomfortable, because it's questioning and it's unpacking the things that have been so normalized. And I mean, me myself, I get corrected all the time. You know, it's part of even at work and in our team setting, that's part of the learning process. But the scary thing is that for people that get so caught up and so worried, that they'll either, their fear and their discomfort will take up such large space within the conversation that it leaves no room for us to do the real work. And it's really exhausting for those of us to feel like we're kind of just spoon feeding. Just get uncomfortable with making mistakes, be okay. Don't be so afraid that you're just paralyzed, that you're no longer doing anything, because inaction is also not an option either. And again, I just wanted to make sure that I put down our decolonization research guide in here, because we had anticipated that people would be asking these questions. And so there are pieces of this. If you go to the research tab, which is the second one down from home, you're able to, there's an entire box that's focusing on the researcher. You're talking about self-identity, positionality, and we've pulled on some really great resources, both on and off campus, that our colleagues have created. So let's save people some time and not reinvent the wheel, I think.
Totally. Okay, on to question 6. Have you worked with faculty or instructors at your institution who are looking to decolonize or indigenize their syllabi or curriculum? How do you support this work? What is the library's role in it?
Yeah, so a lot of our ongoing or really strong relationships, just speaking to Huihua as a whole, usually are coming from critical and Indigenous studies or First Nations and endangered languages. And a lot of the faculty that are in these departments are usually pretty comfortable with having these conversations. So it's more or less just, they're already doing their decolonial syllabi and lesson planning and stuff like that. So it's more about just helping people with the basics of okay, how do I actually find the resources now? But then there's the flip side of that, which are the non-Indigenous folks or folks that might be just new to UBC or something like that. And we get questions from all sorts of patrons, right? School districts, public libraries all over the place, smaller school libraries, all this kind of stuff. And if they're usually what I'll do is I'll pull on the Center of Teaching and Learning Technologies Indigenous Initiatives at UBC. So Indigenous Initiatives is a rather large team now, and this is kind of their area of expertise. They're the ones that help faculty and staff, and they also have openly accessible resources as well. So I just want to grab their site and put it in the chat here for folks. And they've got some really amazing openly accessible resources as well for folks who are starting this work or trying to figure out, how can this apply to my work? And we will partner and collaborate with them quite a bit, because our role, so going back to the second part of this question, is our role as a library is to make sure that we are pulling the relevant resources, whether that's from our collection or just finding them openly accessible as well. And okay, where are they going to be best suited for this particular ask? So we've done workshops and we've helped to collect resources that are specific to Huehua, so that Indigenous initiatives can create kind of a one-stop shop, so that people aren't flying all over the place trying to gather all this stuff. They've created quite a bit of really great stuff for people.
Okay, now on to question 7. Sometimes in libraries, decolonization and indigenization work are siloed in certain roles or departments. What are some approaches you have or would use to expand the scope to include all library staff?
I'd say, first of all, that we just have to remove the hierarchical barriers that are there. There's lots of times where you're like, okay, well, just the librarians are going to go, or just the the library assistants are going to go, and our work doesn't look that different in these conversations. So that siloing doesn't make much sense. In question one, I'd been talking about the ISP steering team for UBC Library, and I'd mentioned before that like it's the librarians and the lib techs, like we're all going in on this conversation. And usually with the library technicians, this is where you end up seeing quite a bit of the diversity in these spaces. So it, to me, doesn't really make much sense to separate and silo those conversations. I've even seen instances where, depending on the nature of the task or of the committee's group, or what the goal is, where we've even invited student librarians to come in, and that might make perfect sense. I mean, especially around, we're talking about indigenizing or decolonizing. Bringing our students in, I think, is first of all a really important part of their learning. But they also, these are kind of our new generation of folks that are coming in, regardless of age. They're the ones that are going to then be either coming in with us once graduation happens, carrying on after we've retired or whatever. So it doesn't really make much sense, I think, to have those siloed conversations, especially when we have a collective goal. The other thing that I will say is that I think, yes, but there's the other half of this, which is sometimes I like to have closed spaces. And I've seen this in a couple different professional groups or committees as well, is that it's important to have a safe space where people can very openly, comfortably, and without reprimand, without the fear of, am I going to lose my job? I mean, I think we can all agree that there's some pretty strong foundations that decolonization is meant to unpack and kind of break down in our places of work. And it can be really intimidating to have those conversations when there are people who are not from the same identity group as you that have a lot of power, because now you're censoring yourself. So I wanted to also have a nod and acknowledge Sajni Lacey and Tomoko from the Asian Library and the UBC Okanagan Library. Sajni and Tomoko and I created the IBPOC Affinity Group, which is, just a space for us to have conversations. It can be as casual or as work related or unwork related as possible. And, it's just spots where we can have conversations with one another on topics that matter to us. And so in this IBPOC group, it's not, again, something that we are asking people to put more of our energy, that there's going to be some sort of output from this. But if there is, that's great. But again, having those safe spaces where, okay, in a way, I guess that is siloed. So I think that they're not good or bad. I think that it really depends on what the goal of the group is. What's the problem? What's the committee or the thing, the affinity group or what have you that you're wanting to make? And then when you're thinking about people that you're going to bring in and welcome into the conversation, you obviously do those invitations based off of like a logical, whatever your logical outcome is that you're wanting it to be. So yeah, that's a tough one.
I agree with you about having those affinity groups. I remember last year we had the BCALS event on anti-racism, and it was mostly directed to BIPOC people and non-BIPOC people. But around the same time, I don't remember the people who organized it, but it was for Ontario Academic University Libraries, and it was just a event for BIPOC people. And I really appreciated having those conversations and meeting the amazing library professionals, library workers in Ontario and around the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. Like, I've also even seen this outside of professional work, but I've even seen this where essentially people were just interested in the experiences of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer people. And the invite, we had no control over the creation of this talk or this group. And the organizers did not belong to this identity, or they did not identify as Two-Spirit or Indigiqueer. And so the invitation was then opened up to allies as well. Then, because of our relationships, what we found was that there weren't any Indigiqueer or Two-Spirit people in the room. And so then it changed the nature of the conversation, because we found ourselves in these spaces where they took up so much space that we were just trying to pacify people or to get rid of their anxiety or to educate. And it completely changed what the goal was for the group, right? The other one was, because you're also talking about at the national level, and I also attend a mentorship group called Escapeo mentorship, and it's for Indigenous librarians. And again, it doesn't, so we've got folks that have been within the profession for a long time, very, very long time, people who are new like myself, and also student librarians are more than welcome to come. And now it's just us having that conversation in the room, and it gives us, again, the need is to have conversations about what we're up to, but also the whole goal of the mentorship is to make sure that we know who our students are, we know who one another is, so that we are being looked after, because sometimes we might be the only Indigenous librarian in our place of work, right?
Totally. Okay, so now I think this might be the last question. Okay, so what is the work you would like to see done, or projects you're looking forward to around decolonization and indigenization in academic libraries?
Okay. Yeah, the first one I think is one that I've always been really optimistic about, even from the time that I was in my undergrad as a student. And I really think that, speaking to my own context, UBC as a whole has such an incredible amount of brain power and knowledge. I mean, what we generate is very valuable, and it's not, and I'm talking like valuable money-wise, and also the societal impacts that we have. And what I've always wanted to see happen is to have that work taken off campus or mobilized in such a way that it supports people that really need it. Because at least where I'm at, the people that are working, studying and living at UBC, it's such a privilege. It's such a privileged position to be in. And we have so much to give back, and we have so much that we can offer. And that connection, I think, is still really new. So I wanted to acknowledge the UBC Learning Exchange and Nick Ubels, who's also a new librarian who's working there as well. And I know that there's just so much potential, even within the Learning Exchange there, for this to happen and to take place. And that to me is just a reciprocal way of existing on these lands, both to our urban community, but also to the nations that all these spaces, all of our places of work have plopped ourselves down onto. So that's something that I'd really like to see strengthened and take place. And I'd also like to see a refocusing back to the students as center. At the Vancouver campus, we're so big, and oftentimes I find that in addition to our day-to-day activities and all of the things that we need to do for work, for lack of a better phrase or term, the institutional hoops that we have to jump through. And it can be really easy, I think, sometimes to just lose track of the fact that this is a school and the students, and within my context, it's the First Nations House of Learning students, our Indigenous Student Collegium. Those are the people that I serve and work with, as well as our host nation. There needs to be a refocusing back to, this is why we're here, this is why we exist here, and making sure that our services reflect that. And yeah, I think lastly, I'd really like to see an increase in the diversity of hires, and that there's a stabilization that allows for the longevity of those positions. So just because something looks really good right now and it's just a hot topic, let's just create a one-year contract or something like that. I would really like to see more diverse hires at all institutions, all academic libraries, all UBC libraries, because you'll notice that, and I did this on purpose, that throughout answering all 8 of these questions, I have named people that we've been working with and that I have really amazing relationships with, and that's not an accident. I wouldn't be able to do any of this if we weren't sharing and if these folks did not exist in these spaces. So I would like to see more of that.
Okay, that's great. Relationships are really important in library land.
Library land.
Okay, so I think we're now onto the, what do we call it? The audience questions. So amazing, Karleen. So now let me just see if there are questions. Okay, so the first question is, how do we balance the active and reflective practice of decolonization with institutions push to always be providing that we are doing things?
Yeah, it kind of feels like we're always getting things added to our plate, but nothing's falling off the table or being consumed fast enough, right? Or our plates aren't big enough. I've been taught by lots of reminders from my head, Sarah DuPont, saying, don't say yes to everything, or make sure that what you're signing yourself up for is manageable. Reminders to take care of ourselves and to make sure that we're not gonna burn ourselves out. I think that there's a tremendous amount of pressure to be juggling so many balls, so many responsibilities. And I personally walk toward the projects and the work that makes is heart work, that really gives back to me. That decolonization and anti-racism LibGuide, the seed had been planted for that several months before, and I let it kind of percolate and then all of a sudden it took a couple months, like we just created it. And I think that was because I picked it up when the time felt right and I believed in what I wanted it to do. So no is a complete sentence. If I'm being asked to do something, I'm not going to sit there and resist it too much, but it's kind of, why am I being asked to do that? What's the goal of this? Does that line up with my values as a person and as an Indigenous librarian? Is that something, who do I work for? So again, that reminder of the students or my Huehua team or this iSchool students that we supervise, how is that going to benefit them? How does that serve them? And if, you're paying attention to my gut, if it doesn't feel good, I'm just not. And yeah, there are some things that we are asked to do that make us uncomfortable and that we don't really want to. Is there a way that I can reshape that? Is there a way that I can reshape that ask so that it brings value to my work? Because if I don't, I know that Sarah's going to be like, why are you so tired? You're going to burn yourself out or something, right?
Thank you for that. provide some mentorship to some BIPOC early library workers and students. And I emphasize, understand your capacity. They're asked to do so much work. I really like the idea of hard work that you talked about. And so I will put that in my bag when I provide some mentorship to them. Okay, so second question. Do you have some favorite decolonizing resource that inform your own work in libraries or outside of libraries?
I would say that, yeah, they're gonna, I've got the decolonization and anti-racism LibGuide Opus. Like, well, they're in there. If I liked it, I put them in there. Kwantlen, I put them in there. I've always used this one in the chat as well. There's this resource here. And I've been using this ever since my undergrad. My professors used to pull on this. Both Jeanette Armstrong and Margot Tamez encouraged us to use this. And they use the methodology of the flower because it starts with self and it branches out. And the author uses this methodology. And for me, this is a decolonial, really easy decolonial understanding that can be applied to so many walks of life and so many people. Because it starts again with the flower is the center, and so you're reflecting on yourself, but the flower is also rooted in land. And that's something that I think about quite often and revisit quite often of, especially when things get really tough, when we're asked to do really tough work and we're kind of wondering, how am I going to move forward or make a decision on this, or why am I doing what I'm doing? It's that framework. I think that is a pretty strong reminder for me.
So it looks like we have no more questions from the audience. So I will just ask them to send those questions to Susie, because we could go for a little bit more. And so maybe we'll wait maybe 2 or 3 minutes for some questions.
Is Bister. Sorry, Christian. I noticed when I was saying your last name, I practiced and everything too.
And please send all your questions to Susie.
Can you see the one from William, David?
I cannot see the one from Logan. I did just get.
Will.
Do you want to deal with that one, or can you
Yeah.
repeat that? Because
Yeah.
I can't see it.
William Meredith is asking, thinking of your comments about reference work, can you please speak to how you balance the necessary respect for where Indigenous knowledge is stored and how a researcher might want to use it with your role as gatekeeper? How do you gauge when and how to point research to a source or not? Okay, this one depends. So for the first half of it is, how do I balance the necessary respect for where Indigenous knowledge is stored? I think that the assessment starts with, I always have to remind myself that yes, I'm an information professional, but I'm an Indigenous librarian as well. And so there are certain values that I have at my core that I am unrefutably and unshakable on. So when we have a resource that might have traditional knowledge in it, or if there's concern, right? If there's a thesis that comes through, and even though people have had their names anonymized, there's still enough information within this thesis that in a small community setting, people will know who those people are. So it depends on who the researcher is, how they plan to use this, and the resource itself. And so I think that there's multiple layers to understanding that. Is who was the person that wrote the thesis or the resource? Do they talk about how they collected that information and are now sharing it? What are the permissions on that I can extract even from the source itself? That's one piece of it. So what can I what's the summary that I can get from the resource itself? Is there anything in this that I am concerned will be harmful? Yes or no? Not really sure. Then what's the use of it? Is somebody, there's a different way that I would assess something if someone says this, like, well, yeah, we've got these resources and they've got all this Musqueam content in it. And I know for a fact that the person that's within this is like that person's relative. I'm going to gatekeep differently, or I'm going to safeguard, or I'm going to have a different safety protocol around how I would give access to that. And again, making sure that this is not something that I do by myself. Like, I'm not able to immediately make that decision because I need other voices in the room. So fortunately, in my context, I've got Kayla Larson, Sarah DuPont, Eleanor Wellwood, and Tamis Cochran. And like I said, I mean, sometimes we'll sit with a resource. We could sit there for like an hour and we still might not come up with a conclusion. But what we have come up with is 5 different perspectives on all of these yes buts, all of these what ifs. And so then again, I'm not making these decisions by myself either. So there's always that kind of consultation piece, and making sure that I've checked in with my colleagues, my team, and my work family to say, because we share this, we share that responsibility. We share if things go wildly wrong, that's all on us. And how do I gauge when and how to point researchers to a source or not? There's a resource that I really like to use, and it's escaping me right now, but I know exactly where it is in the stacks in the branch. And it was published by Musqueam. And what I love this book is that it's got do's and don'ts. They've shared and they've published and they've made it accessible now because there's a print copy. And anybody that purchased it can have it. And they have all of this information about themselves. But what they also have is do's and don'ts. Do use this in this way. Don't use it in this way. Consult with us for this. And whether it's related to Musqueam or not, I've used this to show people this is the kind of caution that we need to have. Just because something is available to us doesn't mean that we're not a part of that process of we're now going to take this up again. And we as researchers and we as information professionals, then we have a ripple effect in that as well. And so are we having a positive impact, a negative impact? Have we thought of all the yes buts or the what ifs? And what are our gaps in those questions? What are the things that we're unsure of or that we need to learn more about or to research more? That's kind of how I gauge what the next steps are in finding new sources. So that one's harder. It depends.
Okay. I think the next question is, I'll quote what they said. I don't know if this is too specific, but I'd love to have some advice on how we weed an Indigenous collection. I'm concerned about some of the outdated content in ours.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm trying to find. Okay. So for this, I want to acknowledge Emily Florenwald, Wendy Traz, Stephanie Marson or Marston. I think I saw Wendy in here. If anybody can, I know I've got the acknowledgements correct within this resource that I'm about to share. The best that we've got so far is if you look at our Indigenous children's literature, we've got a critical literacy and a critical literacy tab, as well as virtual kits I like to go kits because we made these in COVID when I couldn't make a kit, the physical one. And Wendy and Emily and Stephanie, they have these critical Indigenous literacy kits for children's picture books at their branch. And myself and Sajni Lacey for both the UBC Okanagan Library and Huiqua, we're thinking there's pieces of this that would be so useful for ourselves. And this is specific to children's literacy or children's picture books, which for me is really helpful because these sections are huge. And they also, at our branch, are pretty large. They are also the ones that give us the most pain with reshelving. They're the ones that have some of the most outdated materials. And when thinking about their impact on children, to me, I think is a big, I think to say safety concern seems like really explosive, but I don't want to give a child a bad resource that shows stereotypes of an Indigenous person to a kid because they're so little, they're so impressionable. So the impact I think is pretty great. But what you can pull out from this and tease out from this is pieces of, if you look at the resources if you look at the resources from that tab on that LibGuide, what you'll find is questions that people can ask themselves when assessing a resource. And these were adapted from the work that was done at Education Library. So again, just acknowledging all of their hard work. We don't yet have an official policy for reading, but we really need it. And Susie Wilson, if you would like to connect with me via email, I'm going to put this into the chat so that when I do get something more formal that we can share this. But to the best that we have so far, the questions that we ask within those resources there to assess not just children's books, but this could be adapted to other parts of the collection as well, which it will be.
I look forward to seeing the other guides that you have for the other resources as well. I think we might in the next email we send through Eventbrite, we might send all the resources you talked about. We'll try to find all those resources and send them to everyone. Okay, so no more questions. Let's see. There was a question from Catherine. How do we consolidate resources from different institutions working on similar work without reinventing the wheel?
How do we consolidate resources from other institutions
working on similar work without reinventing the wheel?
Yeah, that one would be, I mean, from that point, you'd almost need to do like an environmental scan, hey, and then see, start with different institutions. So you could go like UBC, SFU, Kwantlen Polytechnic, University of Calgary, and then I think you'd have to figure out what your keywords or your key phrases are, or even the main players or the main creators, whether that's a branch or something like at UBC. Again, we've got Indigenous initiatives from Center of Teaching and Learning Technology, figuring out who are the people that are taking up this work, seeing what resources they have, and then you'd need to assess those on a case-by-case basis to see how different, how similar they are. But what I have seen that's helpful, at least could help to speed up that process, is when people have replicated, adapted, or borrowed with permission from others, there's usually some sort of disclaimer on the page to say, thank you so much from so-and-so from this institution or library, what have you, for allowing us to adapt this work. So that might help it along a bit faster.
Yeah, I think SFU Library thanked Northwest College on how to cite APA 6 and I think APA 7 for Indigenous holders. A different way of doing it than what APA suggested. Having tried to find most of the panelists for this event, it is sometimes really difficult looking through institutional websites for who does this work. It's not sometimes that clear.
No.
Um,
And I mean, we also, I think that we produce different packets. We organize and distribute our information through different tools. It could be a toolkit. For us at Huihua, I mean, I inherited through my role, all these amazing research guides. And so I just fell in love with them. So we've got a bunch of research, we'll always ask ourselves, can we throw this in a research guide? How can this be useful? Because what that does is it allows us to look at our collection, figure out what's helpful for the topic or the ask. And then I think with research guides, they're meant to, again, mobilize the information in a way. There's meant to be some sort of actionable piece to this. There's an ask at the end of it.
Okay, I think since there's no more questions, we could we could end early for the panel and have a longer lunch. Would everyone be happy about that? Because I look for a lunch every day. Okay, so I think we'll do that right now. So so now, let me just share my screen. Apologies. So I think lunch we'll start back up for everything at 12:05 Pacific time for the lightning talks. And I really appreciate Karleen for providing her thoughts. It was really interesting. I really appreciate talking to you all the time. So we are now on break.